I think there's a few things that are enabling hypercasual's fall from grace as kind of like the dominant genre of prior years. And we see that panning out in a few different slides in this deck.
And also the games just suck. We're going to cover a report from a few of our friends at Mintegral. So Mintegral has put together a State of Games Media Buying Spotlight for 2024 in the United States. This includes Mintegral data from 2023 through the first half of this year. Interestingly and unfortunately, it excludes Chinese data, which is someplace they have an immense amount of insight into. And for reasons of, I assume they're not allowed to, they're not actually servicing that data to the public, which is a huge bummer because this is a place that they have a huge advantage over a lot of the Western advertising platforms. And I really would be interested in seeing that data. So we're missing that data, unfortunately, but we'll still run through a few of these things quickly. There's a lot in here. We don't have time to do a deep dive. We're just going to do some quick hits, and I'm just going to jump around a bit. So just jumping to the first part that I think is interesting. This is slide 5, and we'll link this, and you can follow along at home, or you can just download it and look at it yourself. But the overall market, they basically separate the world into the 4 segments that are outside of China: US, Southeast Asia, India, and Middle East. Unsurprisingly, the number of overall advertisers is largest in the US, but the number of ad impressions is largest in Southeast Asia, which is to say they have a lot of users on apps in Southeast Asia, which I thought was just a little bit interesting, although nothing groundbreaking. These next 2 slides are the ones that I actually thought are really, really insightful. What they've actually done, intentionally or not, is given us some insight into the growth of the Mintegral platform, which I thought was pretty interesting. So this is slide 6, and what it shows is from H1 of last year through H1 of this year, we see the number of app advertisers is basically flat with a spike in the middle, meaning that back half of last year, we saw an increase of overall app advertisers and it's fallen back down. So overall, the platform is flat. The number of new advertisers has also fallen by about 30%. So interesting. What does this mean overall?
That new advertiser chart is concerning.
Wow.
But I think it mirrors some of the general trends that we see in the performance marketing space, that like, especially in the current macroeconomic conditions, there's less kind of early stage companies that are going hard on growth marketing and paid ads, and a lot of cuts and downsizing of these teams, and just a perception that like performance marketing paid ads are not as much of a default part of your marketing machine as they were a few years ago. And yeah, I think one view of this is like, this is Mintegral specific.
It is.
But I also think it's indicative of just sort of general trends that we've seen in the industry. And I think maybe there's some cherry picking of like which data they're showing, because it's showing like, well, it's not necessarily a download trend because we see up in H2 2023, but we don't have another H2 to compare to here.
That's true.
It's like there's likely, I mean, we know there's always a big spike in H2. Right. For marketing in every cycle.
Right.
So very interesting.
Yeah. And this is basically their measure of network inventory. And what we're seeing is network inventory is flat and new additions to the network are decreasing. Okay, so this next chart is sort of the other half, which is purchases. The number of ads purchased has decreased half over half. What we see here is a similar trend. We're effectively flat from H1 of last year to H1 of this year with a spike in the middle. And this is ads purchased. Basically, this is buyers instead of sellers, right? And so what we see is a little bit of a delta of new users is also down here. We're about 12% down new users from H1 of this year versus H1 of last year versus 30% in the other chart. But overall, what we're seeing is basically the same chart, which is overall we're flat in terms of purchases with a little spike in the middle for H2. And to the point you just made, we don't have an H2 of last year to compare it to. So interesting to see.
Yeah.
I don't know if Warren even needs other thoughts.
Well, I'm realizing that I misread the prior data set, so apologies for that, because the prior data set was actually inventory based. This is buyer based.
Right.
So we're seeing a shrinking of new inventory, new apps on the marketplace to buy from, but then we're also seeing that trend mirrored in the buyer side with less new buyers.
And flat buyers overall, and then know without the spike. So interesting to see. I don't have like any particular insight. It's just interesting to see how the channel is doing. The parts of this that I thought were interesting where they talked a bit about their ad placements. This is a view of banner versus video versus playable ads by game type. And the overwhelming obvious point of this data set is that video ads are by far the most important segment of the network inventory overall. This is something that should be very, very self-evident. We call these channels rewarded video channels because they are the predominant part of the network overall. Playable ads are a meaningful part in hypercasual, but not huge, about 13% of the overall mix compared to 80-ish% of video ads. And banner ads are about a quarter of the inventory in RPG, but pretty negligible in every other segment. So basically what this is, the high level thing here is Video ads are drastically dominant compared to everyone else, every other ad inventory type, but it fluctuates a little bit depending on what your category is. Any thoughts here, Warren?
Yeah, I think the view might lead to some false conclusions because the way that we should think about playable ads in most contexts is that it is a format that is supported in a subset of video ad inventory. So like to look at this view and make the assumption that like playable ads are worse by either a seller or buyer standpoint, I think would be a false insight, because generally what we found in rewarded video is that if you have a well-constructed playable ad in a video ad unit spot, which is again where they show, it typically will perform better than your top performing video ad. There's exceptions, it varies by network, but that's a general trend. So I would say just like a heads up to not look at this data and say like, oh, playables are less than video, so clearly playable's not working.
Well, and I think here's this next slide, and this is the last thing we'll talk about on this. This shows growth of playables across the entire network from H1 of last year to H1 of this year. And it goes up linearly 3%, 5%, 7% this year. So this is a growing segment. And I think this sort of articulates a similar articulation of what you were just saying, which is our playables can be very good and the penetration is increasing over time. Cool. So, I mean, nothing groundbreaking. Overall, I think there was a couple of interesting trends. Player adoption in terms of how many people there are in Southeast Asia, that was interesting. The slowdown of the channel is interesting. The adoption of playables is interesting, but nothing crazy here. Any final thoughts, Warren?
Saw this reflected in a few different graphs. Kind of snuck in here, but like I noticed in going through this deck that just talking about ranking of different genres by how many impressions they're getting throughout the network, that hypercasual has really fallen down. And that's a trend that we've kind of seen industry-wide. And, you know, there's certain themes here that will beat to death, but like hypercasual, particularly on iOS, really got hit hard with scan and has fallen off. And I think there's another part to hypercasual, and this is a bit of a controversial take, but I think hypercasual as it matures as a segment is just proving to be a lower value segment to buy from, even for a lower price. So I think as the sector gets more mature and people get more data and are able to identify the patterns of behavior from hyper-casual games, at least I can say on our side, we usually will try to like bias out of that kind of traffic because we've generally seen low performance from it as a buyer if you're optimizing to deeper funnel metrics. So I think there's a few things that are enabling hyper-casual's fall from grace as kind of like the dominant genre of prior years. And we see that panning out in a few different slides in this deck.
And also the games just suck. That's it. That's the show. Warren, take us out.
As always, the pod was brought to you by our team here at Uptick. Here at Uptick, we do games growth stuff. We will be your workforce. We make really awesome software to streamline your workflows, add all kinds of cool prediction and analytics, plug and play. And we love games. We're all nerds. That's what bonds us here. So if you're building a cool game and need nice people to help you grow that game, reach us at uptick.com. It's upptic.com.
Talk soon.